I found 3 Olympic-sized swimming pools on my property while walking the fence line of the 800 acres I just inherited from Uncle Herman, and not one of them was supposed to be there. The lawyer's office in Boulder, Colorado had been stuffy and formal when they'd read me the will 3 weeks ago. Uncle Herman had been my father's older brother, a recluse who'd bought up land in the foothills back in the 70s when it was still dirt cheap. I'd visited him maybe 5 times in my entire 32 years, always remembered him as quiet and kind, someone who preferred the company of elk and pine trees to people. When his attorney called to tell me I'd inherited his entire estate, I'd been floored. My name is Henry Richardson, and up until that phone call, I'd been managing a sporting goods store in Denver, living paycheck to paycheck in a cramped apartment. The property sat about 40 miles northwest of Boulder, tucked into the foothills where the plains started their dramatic climb into the Rockies. 800 acres of pristine Colorado wilderness, with a modest cabin, a few outbuildings, and apparently, according to the survey maps, no encumbrances or easements. Uncle Herman had been meticulous about his property rights, the lawyer explained. He'd fought off several attempts by developers over the years to buy him out. I'd taken a week off work to explore the property, walking the boundaries with the survey maps in hand and a growing sense of awe. The land was beautiful, rolling hills covered in ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, with 3 natural springs and a creek that ran year-round. I'd been thinking about maybe keeping the cabin as a weekend retreat, possibly selling off some of the acreage to pay the inheritance taxes. That's when I found the pools. The first one appeared through the trees like a mirage. A massive rectangular pool, easily 50 meters long, surrounded by concrete decking, lounge chairs, and a small bathhouse. I stood there staring at it for a full minute, completely confused. This wasn't on any of the maps. I pulled out my GPS unit and checked my location 3 times. I was definitely on Uncle Herman's property, a good half-mile inside the eastern boundary. The pool was clearly in active use. The water was crystal clear, chemically treated, and I could see a filtration system humming away in a mechanical room attached to the bathhouse. There were fresh towels stacked on shelves, pool toys scattered around, and a sign that read, Meadowbrook Estates Community Pool No. 2, rules posted inside bathhouse. Meadowbrook Estates. I'd seen that name on my drive-in. It was a sprawling HOA community that bordered the eastern edge of Uncle Herman's property, one of those master plan developments with identical beige houses and strict regulations about mailbox colors. But this pool wasn't near the border. It was half a mile inside my land. My confusion turned to disbelief when I found the second pool another quarter-mile northwest. This one was slightly smaller but featured a water slide and a diving board. The sign here read, Meadowbrook Estates Community Pool No. 5. Same setup, same obvious recent use, same problem of being completely and utterly on my property without permission. The third pool was the largest, located on a particularly scenic hilltop with views of the Front Range that probably cost someone serious money to develop. This one had a full pool house with changing rooms, showers, and what looked like a small snack bar. Meadowbrook Estates Premium Pool, residents only, declared the sign. I spent the rest of that afternoon walking the property lines with renewed focus, using both my GPS and the survey stakes that Uncle Herman had apparently maintained. There was no question about it. All 3 pools were built entirely on my land, the nearest one at least 1,000 feet from the Meadowbrook Estates boundary. Back at Uncle Herman's cabin that evening, I started going through his files. My uncle had been an organized man, and his filing cabinets told a story. I found letters dating back 7 years, correspondence between Uncle Herman and the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. The first letters were cordial inquiries about whether he'd be willing to sell a strip of land along his eastern border for community amenities. Uncle Herman had politely declined. The letters grew more persistent. The HOA offered increasingly large sums of money. Uncle Herman's responses remained firm but polite. Then, about 5 years ago, the tone changed. The HOA letters became threatening, claiming that Uncle Herman's unkempt wilderness was negatively impacting their property values, that his refusal to maintain his land to community standards was actionable, that they had legal options. Uncle Herman had consulted with his attorney. The response letters were beautiful, calmly explaining property rights, pointing out that HOA regulations had no jurisdiction over non-member properties, and suggesting that further harassment would result in legal action. Then the letters stopped. The most recent correspondence was from 4 years ago. I found nothing about the pools, no permits, no easements, no rental agreements. Nothing that would explain why 3 massive swimming pools had been built on Uncle Herman's private property. I called the attorney who'd handled the estate the next morning. "Martin, it's Henry Richardson. I've got a situation out at the property." Martin Voss had been Uncle Herman's attorney for 30 years. His voice was steady and professional. "What kind of situation, Henry?" "There are 3 swimming pools built on the land. Big community pools, all belonging to the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. They're not near the property line, Martin. They're hundreds of feet inside the boundaries. The newest one looks like it cost $500,000 to build." There was a long pause. Herman never mentioned pools. "When did you last visit the property?" "Oh, probably 6-7 years ago. Herman preferred to come to my office." "Henry, are you absolutely certain about the property lines?" "I've walked them with GPS and found Uncle Herman's survey stakes. These pools are definitely on my land. Did Uncle Herman have any agreements with the HOA that might not have been in the main files?" "Nothing. I reviewed everything when preparing the estate." Herman was very clear about his property rights. He fought off the HOA multiple times. Martin's voice took on a sharper edge. "This is trespassing at minimum, possibly criminal fraud depending on how they acquired the permits. Do you have photographs?" I spent the next hour documenting everything. I took pictures of each pool from multiple angles, photographed the signs, got clear shots of the GPS coordinates, and took video walking from the survey stakes at the property boundary to each pool location. I documented the addresses on the buildings, the utility connections, everything. Martin called me back that afternoon. "Henry, I've done some preliminary research. Meadowbrook Estates filed for building permits with Boulder County for all 3 pools. The permits show the locations and they're clearly on your property. But the land ownership documents they submitted with the permits show those parcels as belonging to Meadowbrook Estates, HOA. How is that possible? Either it's a surveying error, which seems unlikely given the distances involved, or someone at the HOA knowingly submitted false documents. I'm leaning toward the latter given Herman's history with them. The permits are dated between 2 and 4 years ago. This was all done after Herman stopped responding to their letters. My stomach tightened. So they just decided to build on his land without permission. It looks that way. Herman was elderly, living alone, didn't get around much in his final years. They may have assumed he wouldn't notice or wouldn't fight it. "Henry, this is serious. We're talking about fraud, trespassing, potentially theft of property use. The value of what they've built on your land is easily over $1 million. What do I do? First, I'm going to send a formal letter to the HOA board, informing them that they are operating facilities on private property without permission and demanding immediate cessation of use. Then we're going to need to meet with them. Depending on their response, we may be filing both civil and criminal complaints. Can you come to my office tomorrow? We should prepare this carefully. I drove to Boulder the next morning, my mind racing. I'd been thinking about this as a simple property dispute, but Martin was right. This was much bigger. Someone at that HOA had deliberately falsified property documents to steal the use of my uncle's land. They'd gambled that an elderly recluse wouldn't notice or wouldn't have the energy to fight. Martin's office was in a renovated Victorian on Pearl Street. He had everything laid out on his conference table when I arrived: survey maps, tax records, the HOA correspondence, and printouts of the building permits. "Look at this," he said, pointing to one of the permits. They submitted a property deed with the permit application. It's a forgery. The document purports to show that Meadowbrook Estates purchased 15 acres from Herman Richardson 4 years ago. Herman's signature is on it. I looked at the signature. I'd seen Uncle Herman's handwriting in his files. This wasn't even close. "This is insane," I said. "How did the county not catch this?" The county permitting office processes hundreds of applications. They're not handwriting experts, and they had no reason to suspect fraud. The document looked official, had the right formatting, and the parcel descriptions were detailed. They probably gave it a cursory glance and approved it. Martin leaned back in his chair. "The question is, who at the HOA knew this was fraud? Was it the whole board? Just the president?" "We need to find out." We drafted the letter that afternoon. It was formal and direct, informing the Meadowbrook Estates HOA Board of Directors that they were operating 3 swimming facilities on private property owned by Henry Richardson, that they had no permission or legal right to do so, that all use must cease immediately, and that the property owner was prepared to pursue all legal remedies, including civil damages and criminal complaints for fraud and forgery. Martin sent it by certified mail and email that evening. We got a response in less than 2 hours. The email came from someone named Patricia Brennan, identified as the HOA president. The tone was dismissive and condescending. "Mr. Richardson, there seems to be some confusion regarding property boundaries. Meadowbrook Estates owns the parcels on which our community pools are located. We purchased this land legally and have proper permits for all structures. Our records show clear title. Perhaps you should review your survey maps more carefully. Regards, Patricia Brennan, President, Meadowbrook Estates HOA." Martin read it and laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. She's either complicit in the fraud or completely incompetent. Either way, this is going to get ugly. I'll respond demanding a meeting and documentation of their supposed purchase. His response was polite but firm, attaching copies of the authentic property survey, tax records showing continuous ownership by Herman Richardson until his death, and a demand for the HOA to produce any documentation of their claimed purchase, including title insurance, closing documents, and payment records. The response came the next morning, and the tone had shifted. Patricia Brennan's email was defensive and aggressive. "Mr. Richardson and Mr. Voss, Meadowbrook Estates has operated these facilities for years without any complaint from Mr. Herman Richardson. We have invested significant community resources in these amenities, which serve over 500 families. Any attempt to disrupt their use would cause substantial harm to our community. We suggest a meeting to discuss reasonable compensation for an easement or lease arrangement. We are prepared to be generous. Patricia Brennan." "Now we're getting somewhere," Martin said when I called him. "She's not providing documentation because she can't. She's moving straight to negotiation, which means she knows they are in trouble. But notice what she's not saying. She's not apologizing, not acknowledging wrongdoing. She's trying to make this your problem and their solution. I don't want their money for an easement, I said. They stole my uncle's land. I know. But let's take the meeting. I want to see what they have to say in person. Sometimes people reveal more than they intend to. We scheduled the meeting for the following Monday at the Meadowbrook Estates Community Center. Martin suggested I dress professionally and keep my emotions in check. Let them talk, he advised. Let them dig their own hole. The Meadowbrook Estates Community Center was exactly what I'd expected. A bland stucco building with beige trim and a parking lot full of subs. The development itself was sprawling. Hundreds of identical houses arranged in careful curves, every lawn perfectly maintained, every mailbox the same approved style. It was the kind of place where individuality went to die. Patricia Brennan was waiting in the conference room with 2 other board members and the HOA's attorney, a nervous-looking young man named Derek something. Patricia was exactly the stereotype I'd anticipated. Mid-50s, expensive highlighted hair, yoga-toned body, designer athleisure wear, and an expression that suggested she'd been born sucking on a lemon. "Mr. Richardson," she said, not offering to shake hands. "Thank you for coming. I'm Patricia Brennan, HOA president. This is Cynthia Walsh, our treasurer, and Donald Kemper, head of our architectural committee, and this is Derek Paulson, our attorney." We all sat down. Martin opened his briefcase and laid out documents like he was preparing for war. Patricia didn't wait for pleasantries. "Mr. Richardson, I understand you believe there's some boundary dispute regarding our community facilities. I want to assure you that Meadowbrook Estates has full legal right to the land where our pools are located. We purchased that land in good faith and have invested over $1.2 million in facilities that serve our community." "Mrs. Brennan," Martin said calmly, "you didn't purchase anything. You forged a deed and submitted fraudulent documents to Boulder County to obtain building permits. My client owns that land, has always owned that land, and your pools are built on private property without permission." The color drained from Derek Paulson's face. He clearly hadn't known about the forgery. Patricia's expression hardened. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Voss." "I hope you have evidence." Martin slid a document across the table. "This is the deed you submitted with your permit application. The signature purporting to be Herman Richardson is a forgery. I have examples of Mr. Richardson's actual signature, and I've had a handwriting expert provide a preliminary opinion. They're not even close." Derek picked up the document, his hands shaking slightly. He looked at Patricia. "Where did this come from?" Patricia's jaw tightened. "The previous board handled that transaction. I wasn't president then." "But you knew about it when you took over," Martin said. "It wasn't a question. The pools were already built. I inherited the situation. And you continued operating them, knowing they were on someone else's property, hoping the owner wouldn't notice or wouldn't object. Mrs. Brennan, that's knowing participation in theft and fraud." The treasurer, Cynthia, spoke up. Her voice was shaky. "Patricia, you told us the land purchase was legitimate. You said we had clear title." "We do have clear title," Patricia snapped. "We've maintained those facilities for years. We've paid for utilities, maintenance, insurance. We've exercised dominion over that property. If anything, we have adverse possession rights." Martin actually smiled. "Mrs. Brennan, adverse possession in Colorado requires 20 years of continuous, open, and hostile use. Your pools are 4 years old at most. You don't come close to meeting the requirements. And adverse possession doesn't apply when the possession began with criminal fraud." I watched Patricia's face. She was trapped and she knew it, but she wasn't backing down. This was a woman who'd probably bullied her way through life and couldn't conceive of actually losing. "So what do you want?" she asked, glaring at me. "How much money is this going to cost?" "I want the pools removed from my property," I said. "All three of them. I want the land restored to its natural state, and I want accountability for whoever forged those documents and filed false permits." Patricia laughed. It was a harsh, brittle sound. "That's absurd. We're not tearing down $1.2 million of community facilities. Be reasonable, Mr. Richardson. We can negotiate a fair lease. We'll pay you for the land use." "No," I said simply. "You can't be serious. Do you have any idea how many families use those pools? What you'd be taking away from this community? Don't be selfish." I felt my temper rising but kept my voice level. "I'm not the one who built facilities on someone else's land without permission, Mrs. Brennan. Your community's inconvenience is not my responsibility. You created this problem." Derek spoke up, his voice strained. "Mrs. Brennan, I think we need to have a private conversation. Mr. Richardson, Mr. Voss, could you give us a moment?" Martin and I stepped out into the hallway. Through the door, we could hear raised voices. Derek's voice was the loudest, and he sounded panicked. The words criminal liability and fraud charges came through clearly. After 10 minutes, Derek opened the door. He looked like he'd aged a decade. "Could you come back in?" Patricia sat with her arms crossed, her face red. Cynthia was crying quietly. Donald looked stunned. Derek spoke carefully. "Mr. Richardson, on behalf of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA, I want to apologize for this situation. It's clear there were serious irregularities in how the land acquisition was handled. The board needs time to investigate internally and determine how to proceed. Would you be willing to give us 2 weeks to review everything and prepare a response?" Martin looked at me. I nodded. 2 weeks, Martin said, but the pool's close immediately. No community use until this is resolved. Patricia exploded. "You can't do that. It's the middle of summer. We have hundreds of families who have paid HOA dues expecting pool access." "Mrs. Brennan," Martin said coldly, "my client is being generous by not calling the Boulder County Sheriff right now to report criminal trespass. The pool's close today, or we pursue immediate legal action. Your choice." Derek put his hand on Patricia's arm. "We'll close the pools," he said. "Give us the 2 weeks." We left the community center with Patricia's furious glare burning into our backs. In Martin's car, he was quiet for a moment before speaking. "She's going to fight this," he said. "She's not the type to admit defeat. Watch your back, Henry. These HOA types can get vindictive." He wasn't wrong. The harassment started 2 days later. I'd been staying at Uncle Herman's cabin, taking the time off work I'd accumulated over the years to deal with the estate. The cabin was rustic but comfortable, and I'd been enjoying the solitude. That changed when I found the notice stapled to my door. It was printed on official-looking letterhead. Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, Covenant Enforcement Division. The notice informed me that my property was in violation of community standards, specifically citing unkempt vegetation, unapproved structures, junk vehicles, and nuisance conditions affecting neighborhood property values. It demanded immediate compliance within 48 hours or face fines of $500 per day. I called Martin immediately. "They're insane. My property isn't even in their HOA." "Ignore it," Martin said. "It's harassment, and it actually helps our case. It shows malice and a pattern of trying to bully you. Save everything they send." The next morning, I found a Boulder County Code enforcement officer at my door. He was apologetic and clearly annoyed. "Mr. Richardson, I'm Officer Tom Hendricks with County Code Enforcement. I got a complaint about this property. Something about unpermitted structures and health hazards." He looked around at the pristine wilderness. "I got to tell you, this seems like a waste of my time. Who filed the complaint?" "Patricia Brennan from the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. He rolled his eyes. "Yeah, that tracks. Look, I have to do a formal inspection since a complaint was filed, but I can already tell there's nothing here. Give me 20 minutes to walk around and file my report, and I'll note that the complaint was unfounded." He was as good as his word, but 2 hours after he left, another county vehicle pulled up. This time it was an environmental health inspector responding to reports of illegal septic discharge and contaminated water sources. Again, the complaint had come from Patricia Brennan. Again, the inspector found nothing wrong and left irritated at having his time wasted. That afternoon, Martin called with news. The HOA board had an emergency meeting last night. "Derek called me this morning. Patricia has been removed as president." "Really?" "The board members you saw at the meeting, Cynthia and Donald, did some digging. Turns out Patricia was on the board when the original fake deed was created. She was treasurer at the time and was directly involved in the fraud. She knew exactly what they'd done and has been covering it up for years. The current board wants to settle. They're offering to remove the pools and restore the land at their expense." "What about Patricia?" "That's the interesting part. The board wants to cooperate with any criminal investigation in exchange for limited liability. They're willing to testify that Patricia and 2 former board members, who have since moved away, were the ones who orchestrated the fraud. Derek's drafting a formal settlement proposal." I should have felt relieved, but something bothered me. "Martin, if Patricia's been removed from the board, why is she still filing complaints about my property?" There was a pause. "She shouldn't be. She has no authority to act on behalf of the HOA anymore. If she's filing complaints in the HOA's name, that's another problem. Henry, I think you should consider installing security cameras at the cabin. Patricia strikes me as someone who doesn't handle losing well." I drove into Boulder that afternoon and bought a complete security camera system. I spent the evening installing cameras covering all approaches to the cabin, the driveway, and the main paths to the pools. I also put game cameras at each pool site. My caution proved justified. At 2:47 a.m., motion sensors woke me. I checked the camera feeds on my phone and saw 2 people at the main pool, the one with the premium pool house. They were carrying what looked like spray paint cans. I called 911, grabbed a flashlight, and headed toward the pool. I stayed back, just close enough to see what was happening. In the moonlight, I could make out Patricia Brennan and a man I didn't recognize. They were spray painting graffiti all over the pool house, crude and offensive phrases. The sheriff's deputies arrived within 15 minutes, their spotlight catching Patricia and her companion red-handed. I walked down to meet the deputies, my phone recording everything. "That's my property they're vandalizing," I told the lead deputy, a woman named Sergeant Morrison. "I have security footage of the whole thing if you need it." Patricia saw me and her face contorted with rage. "You destroyed our community. Those pools belong to everyone. You're nothing but a greedy outsider who doesn't care about families." "Madam, you need to calm down," Sergeant Morrison said. "You're on private property without permission, and we have you on camera vandalizing this building. You need to put your hands behind your back. This is harassment. He's the one who should be arrested. He stole our pools." The second deputy, a younger man, took the spray paint cans while Sergeant Morrison cuffed Patricia. The man with her turned out to be her husband, Robert, equally belligerent and equally arrested. At the sheriff's station later that morning, I gave my statement and provided copies of the security footage. Sergeant Morrison was thorough and professional. "Mr. Richardson, has Mrs. Brennan been harassing you in other ways?" I showed her the fake HOA violations, explained about the false code enforcement complaints, and gave her the background about the pools and the fraud. Her expression grew more serious as I talked. "This is escalating," she said. "Vandalism, harassment, filing false reports. Combined with the underlying fraud with the pools, Mrs. Brennan has a serious problem. I'm going to refer this to the DA's office. You might want to consider a restraining order." Martin filed for a temporary restraining order that afternoon. The hearing was scheduled for 3 days later. In the meantime, the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board sent over their formal settlement proposal. It was comprehensive and surprisingly fair. The HOA would remove all 3 pools at their expense, restore the land to as close to natural state as possible, pay for an independent environmental assessment to ensure no contamination, and pay me $150,000 for the unauthorized use of my property over the past 4 years. In exchange, I would agree not to pursue civil action against the HOA itself, though the settlement explicitly preserved my right to pursue claims against individual board members who'd participated in the fraud. The board also included a letter explaining their internal investigation. Patricia Brennan, along with 2 former board members named Keith Morrison and Linda Chen, had orchestrated the fake deed in 2021. They'd been frustrated by Uncle Herman's refusal to sell and had noticed that he rarely left his property. They'd gambled that he wouldn't notice pools being built half a mile from his cabin, screened by trees and terrain. The plan had been Patricia's idea. According to meeting minutes they'd found from that time period, Keith Morrison had moved to Arizona in 2023. Linda Chen had relocated to Washington State in 2024. The board was providing their contact information to law enforcement and had engaged a separate attorney to represent the HOA's interests while cooperating with the criminal investigation. Martin advised accepting the settlement. "It's a good offer, Henry. They're taking responsibility for the removal and restoration, which will cost them far more than $150,000. And you're preserving your right to go after the individuals who actually committed the fraud." I agreed. We signed the settlement the day before the restraining order hearing. The hearing was in Boulder County District Court. Patricia showed up with her own attorney, a combative man who immediately started arguing that I was the aggressor, that I destroyed community property, that the restraining order was unnecessary. Judge Sandra Martinez cut him off. "Counsel, I've reviewed the file. Your client was arrested for criminal mischief after being caught on video vandalizing Mr. Richardson's property at 3 in the morning. She also filed multiple false complaints with county agencies in what appears to be a harassment campaign. What's your argument for why a restraining order isn't appropriate?" Patricia's attorney floundered. "Your Honor, my client was emotionally distraught about the loss of community facilities that served hundreds of families. She reacted poorly, but she's not a danger to Mr. Richardson. She committed vandalism on his property in the middle of the night," Judge Martinez said dryly. "That suggests otherwise. The temporary restraining order is made permanent. Mrs. Brennan is to stay at least 500 feet from Mr. Richardson and his property at all times. Any violation will result in immediate arrest. Next case." Outside the courtroom, Patricia's attorney pulled Martin aside. I couldn't hear their conversation, but Martin was shaking his head. When he came back, he looked disgusted. "They wanted to negotiate dropping the criminal charges in exchange for you dropping the restraining order. I told them that's not how criminal charges work, and that you're not the DA. Some people live in a completely different reality." The Boulder County District Attorney's office moved faster than I'd expected. A detective named Maria Santos contacted me the following week to go over everything in detail. She was sharp and thorough, and she didn't like what she'd found. Mr. Richardson, this is one of the more brazen fraud cases I've seen. Forging a deed, filing false documents with the county, building over $1 million in facilities on someone else's land, and they almost got away with it. She shook her head. If your uncle hadn't passed away and you hadn't walked the property lines, they might have succeeded with their adverse possession plan eventually. What happens now? We're filing charges against Patricia Brennan, Keith Morrison, and Linda Chen. Forgery, fraud, filing false instruments, theft by deception. We're also looking at charges against Mrs. Brennan for the vandalism, filing false reports, and harassment. The other 2 HOA board members who are cooperating will likely testify in exchange for immunity. How long does this take? Months, probably. Morrison and Chen are out of state, so there's extradition issues, but we'll get there. These are serious felonies, Mr. Richardson. Your uncle's property rights were systematically violated, and we take that seriously. Meanwhile, the pool removal began. The HOA hired a demolition company that specialized in swimming pool removal. I watched with mixed feelings as the first pool was drained and then systematically torn apart. It was wasteful, all that money and materials going into dumpsters, but it had been built on a foundation of fraud and theft. The contractor they'd hired was professional and thorough. They didn't just remove the pools. They excavated the entire footprint of each facility, removed all the concrete and plumbing, and hauled away every bit of material. They brought in an environmental company that tested the soil for chemicals and contamination. When they found elevated chlorine levels around the pools, they excavated and replaced that soil too. The restoration took 6 weeks. They graded the land to match the natural contours, brought in native soil, and replanted with native grasses, wildflowers, and shrubs selected to match the surrounding vegetation. By the time they were done, you could barely tell anything had been there. I spent a lot of time at the property during those weeks, camping at the cabin and exploring the land. Without the pools and their users, the property was peaceful again. I started to understand why Uncle Herman had loved it so much. Elk grazed in the meadows at dawn. I saw black bears, foxes, and one morning, a mountain lion passing through like a ghost. I also started to reconsider my plans. I'd been thinking of selling most of the property to pay the inheritance taxes, but the more time I spent there, the less I wanted to let it go. The settlement money from the HOA would cover the taxes. I could afford to keep it. The sporting goods store in Denver felt increasingly irrelevant. I called my manager and gave notice. I was done with the city. The criminal case proceeded slowly through the system. Keith Morrison was extradited from Arizona in September, protesting loudly that he'd just been following Patricia's lead, that he hadn't really understood what they were doing was illegal. His attorney negotiated a plea deal, cooperation and testimony in exchange for reduced charges. Linda Chen fought extradition from Washington, claiming she had no involvement in the fraud and that she'd been a junior board member who just voted the way Patricia told her to. The evidence contradicted that story. She'd been the one who actually created the forged deed, according to digital forensics on her old computer. She eventually gave up fighting extradition in November. Patricia Brennan went to trial in January. I attended every day. The prosecution laid out the case methodically. The correspondence with Uncle Herman, his repeated refusals to sell, the sudden appearance of the forged deed right after those refusals, the building permits filed with fraudulent documents, and Patricia's continued cover-up and harassment even after being caught. The defense tried to argue that Patricia had believed the deed was legitimate, that she'd relied on advice from the HOA's previous attorney, that she'd been trying to serve her community. It fell apart under cross-examination when the prosecution produced emails showing Patricia had specifically instructed Linda Chen to create a deed that looks legitimate and to make sure Richardson's signature is close enough. Keith Morrison testified for the prosecution, describing how Patricia had convinced the board that Uncle Herman was mentally declining and wouldn't notice or care about the pools, that they were providing a service to the community, that they'd be improving property values for everyone. He admitted he'd been willing to go along with it because the community wanted the pools, and he'd trusted Patricia's judgment. Linda Chen also testified, describing in detail how Patricia had directed her to forge the deed, how they'd practiced Uncle Herman's signature from samples on public documents, and how Patricia had assured her it was a gray area legally, and that adverse possession would cover them eventually. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They found Patricia guilty on all counts: 3 counts of forgery, 3 counts of fraud, 3 counts of filing false instruments, and 1 count of theft by deception. The vandalism and harassment charges had been handled separately in a plea deal where she'd pled guilty to avoid trial. Sentencing came in February. Judge Martinez, the same judge who'd granted the restraining order, did not go easy on Patricia Brennan. Mrs. Brennan, you orchestrated a systematic, deliberate fraud that violated a private citizen's property rights for years. You targeted an elderly man living alone, gambling that he wouldn't discover your theft or wouldn't have the resources to fight it. When you were caught, rather than accept responsibility, you engaged in harassment and vandalism. You've shown no remorse and no understanding of the seriousness of your crimes. This court sentences you to 6 years in the Colorado Department of Corrections, with credit for time served. Patricia's face went white. Her attorney immediately filed an appeal, but she was remanded to custody that day. Linda Chen received 3 years, eligible for parole after 18 months. Keith Morrison got 2 years, with most of it suspended in exchange for his cooperation, plus 5 years probation. The criminal case is closed, but there was still civil liability. My attorney, Martin, filed a civil suit against Patricia, Keith, and Linda for damages, conversion, and fraud. We also sued Patricia separately for the harassment and vandalism. Those cases settled out of court. Patricia's homeowner's insurance paid out a substantial settlement after determining her actions weren't covered, but that settling was cheaper than fighting. Keith and Linda's smaller settlements came from their personal assets. By the time everything was resolved, it was March of the following year. I'd spent almost a year dealing with the aftermath of Uncle Herman's inheritance and the pools built without permission. The property was mine, clear and restored. I'd used some of the settlement money to upgrade the cabin, adding solar panels, a modern well system, and better insulation. I'd kept the rustic character but made it comfortable year-round. I built a workshop and started a small business building custom furniture from deadfall timber I harvested sustainably from the property. It turned out I had a knack for it, and there was a good market in Boulder for locally sourced, handcrafted pieces. I also started leading nature walks on the property, educational tours about Colorado wildlife and ecosystems. I worked with the Colorado Division of Wildlife to create a conservation easement on most of the acreage, protecting it from future development while still allowing me to live there and run my small business. One afternoon in April, I took a walk up to where the premium pool had been. The native grasses had grown in thick, and wildflowers were starting to bloom. A small herd of elk grazed nearby, completely unconcerned by my presence. There was no trace of the pool or the pool house or any sign that humans had tried to reshape this land for their convenience. I thought about Uncle Herman, about his quiet determination to protect this place from developers and HOAs and people who thought property rights were negotiable. I thought about Patricia Brennan, sitting in prison because she couldn't accept that some things weren't hers to take. I thought about how close she'd come to succeeding, how another few years and they might have had an adverse possession claim, how Uncle Herman might never have known what had been stolen from him. My phone buzzed. It was Martin with news that Patricia's appeal had been denied. She'd serve her full sentence. I put the phone away and sat down in the grass. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding thermals up from the valley. The mountains rose in the west, still capped with snow. The land stretched out around me, wild and beautiful and protected. Uncle Herman had given me more than 800 acres. He'd given me a different kind of life, a better kind of life. And along the way, he taught me something important. Your rights matter, your property matters, and sometimes you have to fight for them against people who think rules don't apply to them. The HOA had learned that lesson the hard way. Patricia Brennan had learned it even harder. And I'd learned that inheritance isn't just about what you receive, but about what you're willing to protect and preserve for the future. I stayed up there for another hour, watching the elk and the hawk and the shadows moving across the hillside as the sun tracked west. Then I walked back down to the cabin, to the life I was building on land that was truly, finally, completely mine. The whole ordeal had taken 15 months from the day I first found those pools to the day Patricia's appeal was denied. 15 months of lawyers and courts and confrontations and stress. But it was over now, settled and resolved. The pools were gone. The land was restored. Justice had been served. And I had a future here in the Colorado foothills, living the life Uncle Herman had preserved. Sometimes I give tours to groups from Boulder, showing them the property and telling them about conservation and wildlife. They always ask about the HOA story. It's become somewhat famous locally, a cautionary tale about property rights and HOA overreach. I keep the story short, hitting the key points, but I don't dwell on it. The story isn't really about the HOA or the pools or even Patricia Brennan. It's about the land itself, about protecting wild places from people who see nature as just empty space waiting to be developed. It's about respecting boundaries and rights and other people's choices. And it's about understanding that sometimes the right thing to do is the hard thing, fighting back when someone tries to take what isn't theirs. I've become something of an informal advisor to other property owners in Colorado who have had HOA disputes. The story spreads and people reach out, asking for guidance or referrals to attorneys. I help when I can. Martin has taken on several cases and he's developed a reputation as the attorney to call when an HOA oversteps. One case involved an HOA that built a community garden on a corner of a member's oversized lot without permission, assuming the owner wouldn't mind since it was just the back corner. Another involved an HOA claiming ownership of a private driveway and trying to regulate who could use it. Martin handled both cases successfully, citing the precedent from my case. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA itself went through significant changes. The scandal drove out most of the old board members. New leadership took over with a focus on transparency and operating within actual legal boundaries. They stopped trying to control properties outside their jurisdiction. From what I hear, it's become a much more reasonable organization. I still see people from Meadowbrook Estates sometimes when I'm in Boulder. Most are friendly, apologetic about what happened, embarrassed by Patricia's actions. A few still glare at me. apparently believing I should have just let them keep the pools. Those people don't get that it was never about the pools themselves. It was about the principle that you can't just take what you want because it's convenient. The furniture business has grown steadily. I sell pieces through galleries in Boulder and Denver, and I take custom commissions. Each piece is made from trees that fell naturally on the property or died, and needed to be removed for forest health. I work with the grain and character of each piece of wood, creating furniture that tells a story about this place. The nature walks have become popular too. I limit them to small groups, never more than 8 people, and I only do them twice a month to minimize impact on the wildlife. People pay good money to spend 4 hours walking through pristine Colorado wilderness, learning about the ecosystem, seeing elk and deer and the occasional bear from a safe distance. It's not the life I imagined a year and a half ago when I was managing a sporting goods store in Denver. It's better. It's slower and quieter and more connected to something real. I wake up to elk bugling in the fall, to the sound of wind in the pines, to the creek running high with snowmelt in spring. Uncle Herman knew what he was doing when he bought this land 50 years ago. He knew what he was protecting, and he knew that someday someone would have to fight for it again. I'm glad it was me. I'm glad I found those pools and didn't just ignore them or accept the HOA's claims. I'm glad I had Martin to guide me through the legal maze. And I'm glad the justice system, slow as it was, eventually worked. Patricia Brennan has 4.5 years left on her sentence. I don't think about her often, but when I do, I wonder if she's learned anything. I wonder if she understands that the problem wasn't that she wanted pools for her community, but that she was willing to commit fraud and theft to get them. I wonder if she realizes that if she just accepted Uncle Herman's no and looked for land the HOA actually could buy, none of this would have happened. Probably not. Some people never learn that the rules apply to them too, but that's not my problem anymore. My problem these days is figuring out how to craft a dining table from a massive ponderosa pine that fell during last winter's ice storm, or where to place the new game cameras to monitor the bear den I found in the northern section of the property, or how to manage the beetle-kill trees without disrupting the habitat the woodpeckers have created in them. They're good problems, the kind of problems that matter, that connect you to the land and the seasons and the natural rhythms that cities make you forget exist. I've started keeping a journal, documenting the property through the seasons, noting when different wildflowers bloom, when the elk migrate through, when the bears emerge from hibernation. It's become a record of the land, the kind of thing Uncle Herman probably kept, but that I never found in his files. Maybe someday I'll pass this land to someone else, the way Uncle Herman passed it to me. Maybe I'll have kids who grow up here, learning to love these mountains and forests the way I've learned to love them. Or maybe I'll put it in a permanent conservation trust, ensuring it stays wild long after I'm gone. Either way, it will never have HOA pools on it again. That much I can guarantee. The sun is setting now over the Front Range, painting the mountains in shades of pink and gold. I'm sitting on the cabin's porch with a beer, watching the light change, listening to the evening sounds of the forest. A great horned owl is calling from somewhere to the north. The creek is running high from yesterday's rain. This is home now. Not the apartment in Denver, not the life I left behind. This 800 acres of Colorado wilderness, protected and preserved, wild and free. Uncle Herman would be proud. And somewhere, Patricia Brennan is sitting in a cell, probably still convinced she was the victim in all of this. But the land doesn't care about her grievances or her rationalizations. The land just is, enduring and patient, waiting out humans and their schemes. The pools are gone, the scars are healing, and the elk are grazing where families used to swim. That's justice of a different kind, the kind that matters most. I finish my beer and head inside. Tomorrow I'm meeting with a couple from Denver who want a live edge coffee table, and I have the perfect piece of walnut for it. After that, I'm leading a nature walk for a group from the university, biology students studying montane ecosystems. Life is good. The fight is over. The property is safe. And I get to spend my days working with wood and stone and the wild things that have always called this place home. 800 acres, 3 HOA pools, one hell of a fight. And in the end, the land won, the way it always should.